a lot of you Kentucky folks, Ohio guys are in touch with the various platforms I engage with. But okay, for right now, this is one of the segments during which we have a guest. So it looks like we're pulling him up right now. We're talking to Jonathan Taylor of Title IX for All. And Title IX for All is an organization that, well, we'll get into that with John. Jonathan, are you on the line?
Yes, sir, right here.
All right. So now you wanted to come on to the airwaves here. This is WVLK 590, pretty good-sized Appalachian and Southern radio market. You want to talk about Title IX for All. What is Title IX? Well, what's Title IX, first of all?
Yeah, so Title IX is a federal anti-discrimination law that was written and passed way back in the 70s. The text of it's pretty simple. It just says that any school that receives federal financial assistance cannot discriminate against any individual on the basis of sex. So passed a long time ago, people used to think it was about athletics, and it was for a long time, and it's since then broadened in scope to deal with things like misconduct issues and all sorts of things. And I figure we'll probably talk a little bit about that on the show.
Yeah, so I mean that's one of those things that sounds like no one could oppose it. So the law says that you can't discriminate on the basis of sex. Why does Title IX? No, I mean I think there are obviously a lot of things that even I know about that come up with that. Like, are there the same number of men as versus women interested in playing sports, or are there more? But so why does Title IX matter? Like, if you're a college man, what impact does Title IX have on your life? What should parents know?
Well, on an individual, like college guy level, or same thing for men and women, it's about equal scholarship opportunities. It's about in lower education as well, especially, it's about having equal access to facilities and athletics. It's about fairness in misconduct issues, so making sure that you aren't punished or singled out for anything on the basis of sex. And yeah, it's just, in theory, it's about just having a level playing field for men and women. Unfortunately, a lot of institutions tend to bend it the other way and try and make it into something that I think is contrary to the spirit of Title IX, and that's kind of where we run into a lot of problems.
Okay, and what are some ways that people might interact with Title IX that you think are contrary to the spirit? Are we discriminating against women here? Are we discriminating against guys? How does that work?
So there's these two main competing models of equality, and way back in the 60s and 70s, a lot of people got on board with the idea that no one should be discriminated against. Equality meant equal treatment, equality of opportunity, that kind of thing. But over the years, people decided that was not enough, and they wanted equality of outcomes. And so this meant that you look at the amount of men and women in any particular class or any kind of degree field, and people said, oh, there's not enough women here, so we need more women. So they started discriminating against male students to bring in more female students. This is much more common in the STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math type fields, and so they've essentially tried to redefine equality to mean equality of outcome and to essentially greenlight discrimination against individuals, and that's and there've just been tons and tons of opportunities that have come up over the years that have favored women. Now the attractive sounding pitch of this, if you will, is that women have been historically marginalized and things like that in higher education, but that hasn't been the case generally for decades. And they never tapped the brakes with any of this stuff. They just kept on. They just kept on at full speed with just creating more and more opportunities for women, and men have fallen behind. And they've been behind for quite a while. And so it just creates this. It just creates this lopsided and I think very narrow and rigid and discriminatory way of looking at things, and that's just with the educational opportunities side. In terms of the misconduct side, we get issues where in the late 90s there was this really critical Supreme Court decision Davis versus Monroe County Board of Education, which gave students a private right of action against universities that fail to respond to when they have actual notice of some kind of sexual harassment or sexual assault or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
It gave female students or just students generally a private right of action against universities when they fail to do that, and that kicked off this additional wing of Title IX enforcement, where schools have been increasingly dealing with misconduct issues, and it's unfortunately one of those areas where we never really considered what the boundary, like really
Sure.
where the how far is too far to go with that kind of thing, and then back in 2011, the Department of Education had this what they called a Dear Colleague letter, which told schools what they have to do. It threatened them with loss of federal funding if they didn't get really aggressive on cracking down on sexual harassment and sexual assault and things like that. But it didn't provide adequate due process protections for students who are accused, who are overwhelmingly male. And then it created this situation where tons of male students were expelled or suspended without due process, and it just created a huge mess. And that's been the world that a lot of people have lived in for the last 10 years. So
Yeah. Now,
there's a lot else to it, but yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell.
no, those are the things I hear people talk about when I'm a lawyer by background, although a nice guy despite that. That's one of the things I hear people talk about when they discuss Title IX issues. I mean, quote unquote, kangaroo courts for male students. There are men now sometimes pressing these same sort of charges against women, all that sort of thing, trans issues. But one thing that you said that's actually really interesting, just to pull this back even a little bit beyond Title IX, you said men are kind of falling behind. And that's something I noticed recently, just looking at data sets for a consulting client. Like, right now, at least in the historically black colleges, something like 62% of the people that are getting degrees, it's an insane percentage, are female, as versus 38% for males. So on the one hand, it's great that we have these programs in place, the Cleopatra Scholarship, Strong Women in STEM, and all that stuff. On the other hand, they seem to be less than necessary if 2/3 of the students are women. What caused that? Does that link to some level of discrimination against men, or are men just joining the Army more again? What's going on with the guys? Are men just studying
there's so
less?
much. Yeah, well, there's all of the above and more, really. I mean, when people see an inequality in outcome, they tend to blame the system, and to an extent, the system is at fault. Higher education and education generally has just overhauled itself on multiple levels, just to be more sensitive to women and in some cases favor women. So that's part of the issue. But in a lot of cases, we find that the problems are way earlier in the educational pipeline. They come they originate in like grade school or middle school. With boys, a really big issue is literacy, and with literacy, it really is the key to a lot of educational access, because if you don't have good literacy skills, you're not going to do well in a lot of different disciplines. You're not going to be able to write that paper in your science class. You're not going to do as well in your history class or in your English class and things like that. So literacy really is in terms of the academic deficiencies. There's that. I would also say that boys tend to just not do so well, or they tend to do less well on average than women when you look at single-family homes. And this is especially true if you break it down by race. I know you've done a lot of research on race, but if you look at the differences in educational outcomes between, like, say, black women and black men, both of which tend to grow up in a high number of single-family homes, the black women are doing much better academically than black men on average. And you kind of ask why that is. And I have some theories about that, about the way that people parent students of the same sex. But there's some of that goes back to the family. Some of that goes back to changes in our education system. Some of it is due to what higher ed is doing right now. Some of it's due to the fact that men are more interested in trade schools and technical schools, so you're going to see some pull in that direction in that regard. So it's kind of all of the above and more. And yeah, it's a lack of equal funding opportunities, equal scholarships, equal Pell grants, you name it. It's just men have been kind of getting pulled away from higher education
Mm-hmm.
in so many ways, and it's been like this for a while. Actually, it's not a new problem. What is new is the willingness of people to talk about it. So, you would figure that with it being, like an issue, that people would focus more on, like, oh, are we maybe mistreating men in some cases and stuff like that. But there's no sense of reflection in the higher ed culture generally in that regard, which is really unfortunate.
Yeah, and I mean, as someone who's had a fair number of educational and business executive roles, I mean, this is something that people might say almost as a joke across a lot of sectors, that there's very likely to be some kind of scholarship or assistance to boost you up if you're in some way exotic. You're the
Yeah.
first person in your family ever to go to college, or you're an undocumented quote-unquote refugee from Myanmar or something like that, without even necessarily making fun of all of these. But if you're just a big white, or for that matter, black guy, and you're applying to school in Tennessee, I mean, yeah, there's not necessarily that inherent built-in sympathy where some 5'11"
Yeah.
warrior is saying, I really want to make it to school in STEM, that there might be if that was, a young girl from a background not traditionally associated with those jobs. Okay, so there's also I don't know if we have time for this question, but there's a secondary question where a lot of people will say the educational process itself is becoming kind of less traditional and more anti-male, at least in terms of the male stereotypes. I mean, as
Yeah.
reliteracy, you're no longer going through the classical education where you're reading the Greek myths and Kipling and so on. You're reading kind of
Yeah.
short excerpts from books that have about 85% female authors. No
Yeah.
criticism for the great work they do, but 81% of secondary school teachers are female. They're cutting recess in a lot of schools. The idea is we don't need to let them run around for an hour. They can learn. But I'd assume if you're a 12-year-old boy, that's probably going to impact you a lot more than if you're a somewhat older girl. Any thoughts on that? Like, has education kind of pulled back almost too much from that old Boy Scout
Yeah.
model?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, people call it the feminization of education. I mean, yeah, you're talking about how when boys go to school, like there's now fewer male teachers than there ever have been.
Yeah.
A lot of these boys don't even have a male role model at home, And there's other aspects that people would consider feminization of education in some ways. Like there's been this huge shift to all these people saying, we need to be more have student-centered learning rather than teacher-centered learning. The shift away from kind of a teacher as a semi-disciplinarian type of figure. Boys tend to respond well to authority figures who are direct, who set clear expectations, and who don't let them get away with any BS. They tend to respond well to that. And nowadays, unfortunately, we have a system where not only do a lot of teachers just not exert that type of authority, but administrators fail to back them up in so many cases, and it's just a mess. But was there something else to your question that I'm missing?
No,
I'm
no,
wondering if I'm
that was a
getting
good answer. I think that, again, men and women both have strengths. And not all men
Yeah.
are stereotypically masculine. Not all women are stereotypically feminine. But there clearly is such a thing as masculinity that's associated with guys 90% of the time. And I think if you look at the process away from kind of the Socratic method in school toward group learning, or from just strong mad men executive decision making in business to group conversation or something like that, most people would say society has moved in a more female, softer direction.
Yeah.
That's got some positives, less bullying, but a point you're making that I hear other male leaders making is that it also has really, really obvious negatives, like pathological levels of empathy and struggles for whole populations, including
Yes.
young men. So what am I going to ask about here? Just a quick note: the single fathers thing, I think, by the way, is probably the big issue with a lot of this. I mean,
Yeah, I'd say, I'd say it's a lot of this stuff just starts at home, and you can't expect schools to repair a problem that originates in the home. That they just can't. So yeah, I would agree totally.
That's a good
That's
line
big
there,
issue.
and I'm sure that this is something we could both go on about for 5 or 10 minutes. But just like I'm looking at the data right now from the CDC, a white single father or mother percentage 38, blacks 72, Native American Indians
Yeah.
66. I mean, so like for these very large groups, like no one has a dad. Even for the mainstream Caucasian
Yeah.
population, it's 40%. So you're the
Yeah.
single parent, and partly this is due to the failures of some of these guys, but the single parent's almost always going to be a mom that's going to bring the
Yeah.
motherly rather than the paternal approach to the kid. Then the kid's going to go to school where 80% of the teachers are female. And guys need to step up in both these roles, fatherhood and teaching. But the simple reality is, yes, that's going to affect men more. Okay, we got 3 minutes or so left. What should be done with Title IX? So we have this law in place that says absolute equality. The guys are doing a little worse. You now have the trans issues. Men can play on women's sports teams, or however you'd prefer to put that. What should be done with the law in a minute or two?
Yeah, I mean, really, it's not so much the law itself, it's how the law is enforced. It's all the regulatory agencies that try to make up all these rules for enforcing the laws. We need to get back to the model that equality means equal treatment on the basis of sex for individuals. We need to have a culture in place that recognizes that, just that men and women are different. They do have things that are distinctive, elements that are distinctive to each of them, not unique necessarily, but distinctive. And we need to recognize that, warts and all, as they say. And that requires not just a change in policy, that requires a change in our broader culture and in the culture of our education systems. It really is a multi-layered problem here. So, we could talk for hours about it, but yeah, that's really the gist of it, I think.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. You said the one important thing there just before we cut out. I mean, so there are two ways of looking at equality. There's equality of opportunity, which is what we were all raised in if you're over maybe 30, and then there's equity, which is equality of outcome. Requiring equality of outcome for female athletes with male athletes, even in terms of numbers, doesn't make a lot of sense, in my opinion. Okay, so I'm sure people will call in and talk about that. Okay, how can people reach you just very quickly? How can they catch you on Twitter, website, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so you can just go to our website, title9forall.com. We're at the same handle on Twitter. We're mainly active on Twitter in terms of social media. So you can just find us there. If you have any questions, shoot us a message. We're fairly responsive. And, that's pretty much it.
Well, thank you for coming on. That was Jonathan Taylor, Title IX for All. And all of you guys who have a son heading into college, or for that matter, a daughter, we love the ladies as well, should check out Title IX, where that law is right now. This is News Talk 590 WVLK.